Today I have an important topic that I wish to share with you, and it has to do with understanding the transformations of your life and how they can fundamentally change the overall direction by which you live that life. But before I get into the details of how that might happen and in what way we can handle it, let's just look at the passages that are provided for you today. In the book of Acts, we have just one of also two other recordings regarding Paul's great experience where he is somehow confronted with God. And all I want you to behold in this very short little story is that Saul is filled with vengeance. He wants to bring down those who have defiled the Jewish faith by saying that Jesus was the Messiah and now is raised from the dead. He had trouble with that. He could not understand why they would say such things, and he became a fierce defender of the Jewish tradition. Now, one thing I want you to know historically, and that is Paul would not have had any authority to persecute people outside Jerusalem. And according to the story, he has authority, written papers that come from the leading scribes and Pharisees saying, go ahead and arrest these people, which really was not the common practice at all. Having said that, in the first book of Maccabees, there is a reference briefly to methods of legal implication whereby someone can go after someone else and bring them to court. But let's not be troubled by that. The most important thing is that Paul, meaning now Saul at this point, has a revelation. Apparently a light and a voice. Saul, Saul, why dost thou persecute me? Now, in Revelation, we have something completely different, and you have to understand that the book of Revelation is written in codified Greek so that the Roman Empire couldn't translate it. The whole theme of Revelation is that while the world seems to be going out of control because of Rome's expansive power, don't worry. God will protect you, he will save you, and eventually the empire will implode and crumble. The beast number 666 represents Nero, the emperor. And it's about this time in which John writes this letter. And he's encouraging the church to remain faithful. And at this point, his vision includes an elaborate worship service with angelic beings who are worshiping the Messiah, the risen Lord, giving him praise. And you'll notice at the end of each conclusion in their worship, they say Amen, which when translated properly means, may it be so. And finally, in the Gospel of John, a story you're very familiar with. I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but think of it. Peter is overwhelmed by his grief. And what does he do? He turns to that which he knew before he met Jesus, fishing. And the others say, we'll go with you. When suddenly they have this transformative experience of experiencing their risen Lord, who tells them to cast the net on the right side of the boat. And they catch a lot of fish, which symbolizes the growing faith of the new church, of which Peter is the head. But there's a problem. Peter betrayed his Lord. He's filled with tremendous guilt. Jesus knows this and wants to heal him of his guilt. And so he asks him 3 times, just as Peter denied Jesus 3 times, Simon Peter, do you love me? And in the third call, Peter becomes agitated because he doesn't want to have to answer it anymore. He's sorry for what he has done. And you'll notice that Jesus doesn't say you're forgiven. He just tells him that he now has power to be a disciple, that he will lay his life down as a martyr, and eventually will die for the cause of the faith. All right, turning points of transformation. And one of the first things I want you to understand from the book of Acts is this. All of us live our life according to some kind of perception around what we think life should be or how it should be, and we've taken background and training into our professions and into our way of life, and we say this is the way life will be when suddenly something happens, where suddenly we are challenged with the underlying assumptions of our life in which we say, I'm not happy. I don't like what I'm doing. I wish there was something more that I could bring. Now, unlike Saul, who had this wonderful experience of light and voice, for most of us, that doesn't happen. But there is a deep-seated discontent. We do what we do, but we're not satisfied. We try as we may, but it doesn't come out the way we want it to. And we question the role of our life. And one of the most important things in spiritual journey is to recognize that that is most likely God calling to you. God is asking you to pick a path. Not the path your parents trained you for, not what your society trained you for, not necessarily what your educational facilities trained you for, but for you to be the person that He's always wanted you to be from the beginning of time. Let me give an example. I've had a passion for politics all of my life since I was this high. And of course, I learned history and loved history and excelled at it in school. And I could tell you the prime ministers in their order as well as the presidents of the United States. I was a very well-educated boy when it came to things all matter political. However, something happened. I got my Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. I was a researcher for the Conservative Party in Toronto, and I want you to know I didn't do much research. But I did what I could, and I was frustrated, I was bored, when I received a phone call that my father had died of a massive heart attack. I rushed out to be with my mother in northern Ontario, where they were vacationing when the heart attack occurred. I saw my father. I told him to be good, don't be too hard on the nurses, ha-ha, laughed, kissed him on the forehead and left, only to find out a few days later he died. I went to bed after we buried him, and I had a dream in which he told me to look after my mother. An experience that changed my life and made me do what I don't want to do, which is ministry. Now, I know you find that really amazing. Why don't you want to do it? Please don't misunderstand me. I like what I do. But it wasn't my choice. It was an experience born out of a situation in which I knew that death had no power, and that there is something to this understanding that life is perennial as the flowers in spring. And that somehow I had something that I needed to share, to declare out of my own experience, to let people know that their faith is not found on baseless stories. It has been my mandate since that day to spread what I understand about the gospel, and I forsook politics until I came to Redwater and sat on town council for 2 terms. And I enjoyed it. I did very much with that. I achieved a lot. But my life was always in the church, and I was called back to the church to be with you. Now that's just my experience. There's no light. There's no audible voice. But I was searching. I was looking. And came to do something that I never anticipated I would ever do. Although my mother and my father would say different. And I know that. Let me give you another case in point. I knew a man who went to university and was taking a degree in science when suddenly he felt he wanted to become a farmer. Why did he become a farmer? Because he didn't like what he was doing. And he didn't like the research in the laboratory. He liked the open spaces. And when family situations changed, he decided to become a farmer. So what I'm trying to tell you is simply this. Like Saul, all of us are searching to be God's light in the world. And you have to decide what it is that that light should be for the broken world that you live in. And it's all right to feel wrestling in the bowels of your gut, trying to know what it is that you should be about. And I know that all of you have gone through your various stages, some of you a lifetime career in what you've done, and you're to be commended for it. But the reality is you're still being stirred by God to be something more. That's what it's all about. God calling his children to bear witness to the strength and power of God's reality in this life by being able to be all that you possibly can be. Number 2, Worship is an opportunity. And in Revelation, the angels are worshiping the Messiah as the Son of God. And all of creation is caught up in the great doxology of God's wonderful power. Worship is the place where we can most listen to that inner voice. If you learn to listen and to reflect. Now, one of the big problems that I know happens in church is this, and I've heard this from many people, including myself. You sit in a pew, you do these rotes of prayers which the minister wrote out for you. You sing hymns which people have chosen, and you get the minister who gives a sermon. And in the meantime, your life is discombobulated with all kinds of competing interests while you sit here. And you may be listening to me, you may not. And by the way, I know most of you don't. You laugh, but I know that most of you don't. You're thinking about something else right now. Something unrelated to what I'm having to say. Oh, you're looking at me, you're smiling, and you giggled. So you're listening, I guess. But here's my point. You're here in the quiet of this place in which we do this cacophony of activity to discern what it is that God is calling you to do. I have lots of people who will tell me I don't go to church because the minister's too highbrow. I've had other people who tell me I don't go to church because the music is boring, it's sad, it's lethargic. And I've had people who say, oh, the liturgy is too complicated. I can't get up and down out of my pew. I hear this all the time. Look, I go to church. I don't get everything I want. Do you think I do? And what's worse, I'm a minister. I criticize the minister giving the sermon because I'm critiquing my colleague. That's terrible. And I try very much to come in and tell myself not to critique my colleague, but to listen steadfastly, because he has the truth. But I have to get rid of my prejudice, and I have to clear my head. And my point to you is your worship service gives you whatever you want if you're open to listening, if you're open to reflecting about what I say about your life. And I'm not asking you to listen to me and then hope it happens to you. It can't. I'm only me, but you are you, and you have a destiny. And I might just say 3 words, and that might take you to the back of your brain, and suddenly a light goes on, or a hymn that you're singing that stirs you in your heart, and you know that when you leave this place, you know what it is you want to do. But worship is the place where you can be transformed. Just don't come in with expectations. And my last point, and this is a difficult one. For every failed expectation on our part, a word of love is divinely offered. And I'll give you a simple case in point. When I was a young boy, I had failed grade 4. I also failed grade 1. I was academically very slow. And at one point, the school had said, Stephen should go into perhaps working with wood or metal. He would be better at that than if he continues on an academic course. And I remember my mother had made this big chocolate cake with nice tall glass of milk. And I, of course, as soon as I saw that, I was hungry. And I ran up to the table when my mother said, your father and I want to talk to you. You're not doing well in school, and we don't think you're going to make it into high school. How would you like to go and learn a trade? And my father went on about the values of learning a trade. And my mother just smiled, and then she said something very interesting. She sat beside me, she put her arm around me, and she looked and she said, it's up to you. If you want to keep slugging it out in school, we'll support you, but we don't think you're going to go very far. But I want you to know, whatever it is you do with your life, I will always love you. My father sat there and he smiled. And he said, can I have half of your chocolate cake? And I said, no. I went to university. I'm not the smartest man in the world. I struggled through every paper that I ever wrote. I struggled through every presentation and tutorial presentations that I gave in university. And by the way, I was not a dumb man. I was very smart. And the professors saw that. And I could have gone on, but I didn't. But here's my point. It was my mother's love, her tender word of love, that made me realize that though I was failing, there was still a place for me in the world. That's what brings transformation. Peter feels that he has denied his Lord. He is embarrassed when Jesus asks him to take up his ministry. It's Jesus' way of saying, I forgive you, Peter. I know you're human, but I know that you can lead the church in this difficult time. You may feel you have failed, but there are many people who sing your praises. And that's the divine love that wants to wipe every tear from your eye, sustaining you with faith and grace so that you can be a gift, a transformative gift for a broken world. Amen. Now, was that 15 minutes? No, it wasn't.